we're really living through what the historians call a revolutionary moment in history. It's like something like living through the French Revolution, and fortunately we're living at it for a fairly safe spot. But we can kind of watch it on TV, which is my favorite way of watching a revolution. But what we're seeing is literally the collapse of the big movement of the 20th century, namely socialism. We're seeing the death of socialism, death throes, and socialism was the big movement of the 20th century, the big ideological and political movement. And what we're seeing at the end of the 20th century, this is one very exciting time in which to live, because we're seeing the collapse of socialism, the revolutionary implosion of socialism. What happened was that over the last several centuries, starting in the 17th and going up to the 18th and 19th century, we had a march, an upward march, not of course every day, but basically an upward march of freedom, and the death of the old order, which was statism and serfdom and slavery and theocracy. And rising up from this muck was the idea of individual freedom and the institutions of individual freedom. Personal freedom, religious freedom, political freedom, economic freedom, free markets. And with that came international peace, replacing constant dynastic wars and territorial conquests, and the rise for the first time in history of mass consumption. In other words, standards of living, not only increasing standards of living, but standards of living that were actually rising from subsistence level, where the general public could buy stuff. This is unusual, unique in world history. In the old days, you didn't buy stuff. You didn't go to the store and buy stuff. What you did was the housewife, you bought cloth if you had the money, and the housewife would sew the clothing and stuff. And that was the idea of mass production for a consumer market as an industrial revolution concept, as the product of the free markets of the 18th and 19th centuries. So what you had is, just saying the growth of the standard of living doesn't really encompass that. It's the beginning of a real living standard. And with this, you have a tremendous progress in all areas, in civilization and economics and personal liberty, and technology, which goes along with it. And so the 19th century was the breaking through of this several century-old movement of what we call classical liberalism. Of course, in those days they didn't call it classical. We call it classical because it sort of died out, and we're trying to essentially restore it. And this liberal movement was rising, and everything was going great, and the liberals at the time were very optimistic, as they should be. And then something happened. A glitch happened. Something happened on the way to Nirvana. And the something that happened was the the development of socialism, which was a brand new idea in human history. And the socialist idea, which really sprouts in the 1830s and 1840s in Europe, was that we can still have this, because the previous opposition to classical liberalism, the opposition to freedom, was an opposition in defense of the old order. It was specifically anti-industrial, anti-mass consumption movement. The idea of keeping the lords and the dukes and the earls in their places in the state churches, and keeping their power and position. It was specifically and frankly an anti-general freedom movement and anti-industrial movement. Well, the socialists came along and said, look, we can do both things. We can have the same thing too. We can have higher standards of living. Matter of fact, we'll have better than liberalism or capitalism does it. We can have a high advancing standard of living. We can have freedom, and we can have everybody be happy, and so forth and so on. We can do it through state control. We have better ways through statism, and we can have, in fact, we'll have more state control than before. We'll have the people's state instead of having a class state of a few people running it, a few dukes and kings, etc. We can have the whole people collectively running the people. Okay. So this concept of collectivism was a brand new thing, and it sounded great, and was generally supported by many folk who either yearn for the old order or try to blend the two, liberalism and anti-liberalism, to one allegedly higher synthesis. And so by the end of the 19th century, if you go read some of the classical liberals, it's a sad thing, because the classical liberals of the late 19th century, around 1900, saw the whole thing as cracking. Socialism was on the march, and the general public was backing it. The general public previously had backed libertarianism or classical liberalism. We were a mass movement in the 19th century. In England and much of the continent and the United States, we had the votes. We had libertarian parties, so to speak, not the name, but the actual content. Well, by 1890s or 1900, the days of night were closing in, the shades were closing in, and Herbert Spencer and other classical liberals writing at the time were very pessimistic. Like, the whole thing is shot, civilization has had it, and as such they were right. They foresaw the terror of the 20th century, the gulag, etc., of the 20th century.